Hey, welcome to the briefing. What I'm going to cover with you today is this. Before the boarding surge breaks the rest of the hospital, the emergency department can be full long before the hospital admits it has a hospital-wide flow problem. You can see every room occupied. You can see admitted patients still waiting for inpatient placement. You can watch the waiting room build while another ambulance arrives. Staff are trying to receive what is coming next while still carrying people who should have moved hours ago. That pressure is visible. Nobody has to explain why it matters. Then you look beyond the emergency department, and the picture gets less clear. A few beds appear available in the system, but one still needs turnover, another lacks confirmed staffing, and an expected discharge has no reliable departure time. Transport, environmental services, bed management, unit leaders, and the emergency department are all waiting on the next confirmed movement. Everybody is working, and the hospital is still stuck, and at that point, the bed board is starting to look less like an operating system and more like a hospital horoscope. Technically informative, operationally questionable. And that is where I want to start, because the obvious answer is not quite the right answer. Boarding is the visible problem. No, let me make that more accurate. Boarding is where the failure becomes visible. The operating problem is that the hospital cannot reliably turn expected capacity into usable movement while pressure keeps building. A room that may open is not an available bed. A discharge that may happen is not completed capacity. A patient who can physically be moved is not the same as a patient having a ready, owned, and controlled receiving path. And those sound like small distinctions. They are not. They are the difference between movement and control. The natural response is predictable. Clear the emergency department, find beds, move the admitted patients, open temporary space, accelerate every transition, pull more staff, move faster. I understand that reaction. I mean, look at what the emergency department is carrying. Staff are overloaded. Incoming demand is not going to wait politely while leadership studies the problem. The hospital has to act. So this is not something the leader can postpone. The problem is active. It is interfering with emergency access now, but movement by itself is not control. A hospital can move people out of the emergency department and still make the larger operating condition worse. It can improve one visible number while transferring workload, uncertainty, and risk into another part of the hospital. Clearing the emergency department is not the same as restoring hospital flow. The first can happen through pressure. The second requires discipline. The receiving path has to be ready. The work has to be owned. The temporary action needs limits. The burden created somewhere else must remain visible, and the organization must know when it will reassess. When those conditions are missing, the hospital has not resolved the interference. It has relocated it. And that relocation can feel like success for a little while because the number everybody is watching starts to improve. The bad news has not gone away. It has just agreed to report to a different department. Boarding is a widespread operating problem. Its causes may involve capacity, staffing, discharge coordination, transfers, room turnover, transport, or several of them at once. None can be fully corrected before the next patient arrives. The leader is operating inside a difficult gap. The permanent correction is not available, but the active interference still requires a response. That is where tactical resolution fits. Tactical resolution is controlled stabilization. It is not a permanent answer, a claim that capacity has been solved, or permission to move people wherever physical space appears to exist. It applies when the problem is active, is interfering with the objective, and can no longer be postponed. The leader reduces the immediate effect enough for the operation to continue without allowing the temporary action to become the next system problem. That second part is where leaders get trapped. Pressure changes what people accept as proof. Movement starts looking like success. A room appearing open starts looking like usable capacity. A discharge expectation starts looking like a bed. A temporary location starts looking like a solution. Those things may become part of a responsible response. The mistake is treating possible movement as proof that control has returned. That is displacement being mistaken for resolution. The emergency department looks better while another part of the hospital carries the problem. An inpatient team receives work without a clean handoff. Staff leave other work behind. Unit leaders begin protecting themselves from requests they no longer trust. The hospital moved. It did not stabilize. Now put a leader inside that pressure. Renee is the patient flow director at a regional hospital. Her responsibility is operational. She is not deciding clinical placement or discharge readiness. Those decisions remain with qualified clinical leaders. Renee owns the sequence around movement. She needs to know what capacity is real, what is blocking the next step, who owns that blockage, and whether temporary actions are improving flow or merely moving the burden. She arrives early and receives the first flow report. Several admitted patients still occupy emergency department rooms. More patients are waiting. Ambulances continue to arrive. Staff are trying to receive what is coming next while still holding what should have moved already. The inpatient units report that they are full or close to full. The system shows a small amount of possible capacity. Then Renee starts checking what that capacity actually means. One room still needs turnover. Another is clean, but staffing is not confirmed. One unit expects a discharge, but nobody can give a reliable departure time. Another transition depends on an incomplete receiving path, and this matters because later is not a movement plan. Later is an expectation, a very optimistic expectation wearing a hospital badge and avoiding eye contact. I want to be fair to the people involved here. Nothing in those reports is automatically dishonest. The teams are reporting the reality visible from their position. Bed management sees status. Environmental services sees turnover. Transport sees movement requests. Unit leaders see staffing. The emergency department sees incoming demand. Senior leaders see the total. Everybody has part of the truth, but nobody has a reliable shared picture of which completed action will create the next usable movement. That is the blockage. The problem is not simply that there is no physical space. The hospital cannot reliably distinguish between capacity that might become available and capacity that can actually support the next movement. That is where control begins to break. Renee cannot eliminate every cause of boarding during the morning. She can protect emergency access by creating a reliable picture around the next movements. That is the window she owns. Then the first recommendation comes in. We need to move admitted patients anywhere we can. The frustration is real. Staff have carried the pressure for hours. The waiting room is growing, and incoming demand is not slowing. Anywhere we can sounds decisive. That is why the wrong response cannot be treated like a stupid decision made by a stupid person. The instinct makes sense. That does not make the decision correct. Understandable and acceptable are not the same thing. Anywhere we can is not a controlled destination. It does not establish who owns the work, whether the receiving team can carry it, or what happens next. It is movement without an operating boundary. And here's the justice problem. Once the burden is transferred, somebody else has to carry it. Usually that person has less authority than the person who made the decision. You cannot issue a broad movement order, transfer hidden work into another unit, and then blame that unit when execution becomes inconsistent. You cannot withhold clarity, staffing, awareness, ownership, and limits, then act surprised when the result fails. That is not a frontline failure. That is leadership transferring the consequence downward. I mean, if the receiving team never had the authority, support, information, or staff capacity required to carry the burden, what exactly are you holding them accountable for? No, that is wrong. Renee cannot wait for perfect conditions, but she cannot push the failure into another part of the hospital and call that recovery. So she changes the objective. The goal is not to create the largest possible amount of movement. The goal is to create the next reliable movements while controlling what those movements require. That is narrower. It should be narrower. A temporary action should have a boundary. Broad commands are attractive during a surge because they communicate urgency. They also create local interpretation. One unit hears accelerate movement and pushes every discharge-related task. Another hears find capacity and identifies physical space without confirming readiness. A third pulls staff from work that creates another delay later. Now, the hospital has several versions of the response operating at the same time. The hospital has accidentally created a collection of tiny governments, all issuing foreign policy about the same bed. That is not alignment. That is pressure spreading through separate decisions. Renee establishes a limited hospital-wide flow control period. It does not overrule clinical authority or force every possible movement. Its purpose is to create one reliable near-term operating picture around movement that is actually possible. The hospital identifies usable capacity, near-term transitions, delays waiting on decisions, and temporary moves that could create unacceptable burden elsewhere. Bed management confirms usable beds. Unit leaders identify the blockage. Environmental services confirms room turnover. Transport receives one clear sequence. Case management identifies which transitions matter now. The hospital does not need the full history of every delay. It needs the information that changes the next movement. More data does not automatically create more clarity. Let me make that practical. If information does not change who moves, what must happen first, or who owns the decision, it is not controlling the current response. Renee also establishes what will not be treated as capacity. An expected discharge is not an open bed. A room that cannot support the receiving work is not usable capacity. A temporary location without ownership is not a controlled solution. A staff reassignment without visibility into abandoned work is not free support. Those distinctions protect the hospital from building its response on false capacity. Renee is not trying to slow the operation down. She is trying to stop false movement from consuming the same resources needed for real movement. That is the leadership trap inside boarding pressure. The leader becomes so focused on visible activity that the system loses the ability to distinguish movement that helps from movement that merely changes where the problem sits. And you can see it in the metrics. The number of admitted patients occupying emergency department rooms may drop. That looks positive. But if the receiving location has no clear ownership, the workload did not disappear. It became less visible to the people watching the emergency department. That is why local improvement can create false confidence. The first measure improves. The wider system becomes harder to read. Temporary solutions can feel successful before their cost becomes visible. A patient moves. A room opens. Then the receiving unit carries unexpected work. Another task slips, and a handoff has to be rebuilt. The pressure was visible. The distributed cleanup burden hides the total cost. Other teams absorb the workload and begin protecting themselves from the next request. Flow depends on confidence in the information and in the next request. When trust falls, teams ask for more confirmation, delay commitment, and create local tracking methods. Now, the official system is the single source of truth, supported by 6 spreadsheets, 2 whiteboards, and one person named Denise, who apparently knows what is actually happening. From their position, that may be responsible. Across the hospital, it adds friction. I have made versions of this mistake. I have pushed hard toward a visible objective and treated the transfer of burden as somebody else's problem because the immediate measure improved. That is a weak read. The work eventually teaches you where the cost actually lands. The cost never disappears because leadership stopped looking at it. Somebody still carries it. Somebody reconstructs the handoff, recovers the work, explains the inconsistency, and restores trust. The point is not confession. The point is recognizing the pattern before your team pays for it. And you know, this is where leadership gets unfair. The leader sees the number improve. The person down the line sees the extra workload, unclear ownership, and recovery burden. The leader has to inspect both. That is why cleanup and reassessment are not administrative extras. They are part of the stabilization. Renee needs a review point, evidence that interference is decreasing, and a signal that the action is creating too much downstream burden. Without a reassessment point, the temporary move can continue because nobody wants to be the person who stops it, while the emergency department remains under pressure. A 2-hour workaround becomes a shift process. The shift hands it to the next shift. The next shift assumes it has been approved as normal practice. Now a temporary response has become an unmanaged operating method. That is not stability. That is survival behavior becoming embedded without review. The workaround has achieved tenure. Renee keeps the control period bounded. She does not claim the boarding condition is solved because several movements have been identified. She makes it clear that the organization is stabilizing the current interference and will inspect what the temporary actions are creating. That changes the conversation. Instead of asking only, how many patients moved? The hospital also asks, what did that movement require? What burden did it create? And is the receiving path holding? The first question measures activity, the second tests control. The emergency department carries the visible pressure, but the failure forms between functions. Room status is unconfirmed. Staffing is disconnected from placement expectations. Escalation has no decision owner. And temporary space has no end condition. Those gaps prevent reliable movement. The failure is not inactivity. The failure is activity without a controlled sequence. Speed applied to that broken sequence produces more competing work. Bed management calls the unit. Transport gets a request before the receiving decision is final. Environmental services changes priority based on a room expected to open. The emergency department prepares a movement that gets delayed. Everybody spends time preparing for something that does not happen. The hospital becomes busy around movement instead of effective at movement. The first consequence is confusion. Which bed is real? Which patient is moving? Who owns the next decision? Then teams act on different assumptions. A status changes, but the people relying on it do not receive the update together. Staff prepare, wait, call, confirm, and rebuild the same plan. Then the recovery burden grows. Temporary assignments must end, deferred work must be recovered, responsibilities must be handed back, and patient location information must remain accurate. Without an owner, yesterday's stabilization becomes tomorrow's workload. That is how a short-term correction becomes a long-term drain. Then trust begins to break. Emergency department staff lose confidence that the wider hospital understands their pressure. Inpatient teams expect requests that ignore their load. Bed management becomes the messenger for decisions it does not control. Unit leaders report conservatively because they do not want uncertainty treated as commitment. The operating information becomes weaker because people learn that honest uncertainty may be punished as a lack of urgency. That is dangerous. A hospital needs people to report what is true, including what is not yet known. If pressure teaches teams to make uncertain information sound certain, leadership begins making decisions from false confidence. Acknowledging uncertainty is not weakness. Pretending certainty exists when it does not is weakness. And that may sound like a small language issue, but it is not. When people stop feeling safe telling you that something is not confirmed, they start giving you the answer they think the room wants. Now, you are not leading the real operation. You are leading a story everybody is trying to keep alive. The dashboard says green, the hallway says absolutely not, and somehow both have arrived with legal representation. Tactical resolution needs a clean relationship with reality. It does not reward optimistic estimates. It does not need exaggerated certainty. It needs an honest read of the active interference and a controlled temporary action that can be checked. The better question is not, how do we empty the emergency department as fast as possible? The better question is, what controlled movement will reduce the boarding interference without creating unacceptable failure somewhere else? Think about what that changes. The objective remains urgent. Emergency access still needs protection. The leader is not using caution as an excuse to do nothing. The leader is defining what successful action actually means. A movement is useful only if the receiving path can carry it. A temporary action is responsible only if its limits are understood. A workaround is controlled only if someone owns the follow-through. A stabilization move is successful only if the hospital checks what it created. That is where tactical resolution fits. It addresses an active problem that is already interfering with the objective and can no longer be postponed. The leader has enough information to take a stabilizing action, but not enough time, capacity, authority, or operating space to complete the permanent correction during the current window. The tool helps the leader reduce the immediate effect without pretending the work is finished. In Renee's situation, boarding is affecting emergency access and hospital flow through occupied rooms, uncertain bed readiness, delayed transitions, and fragmented status. The hospital can create one near-term operating picture, confirm usable capacity, assign delayed decisions, coordinate the next movements, communicate limits, and reassess. That is enough to stabilize the interference. It is not enough to claim the hospital solved boarding. Tactical resolution also protects Renee from overcorrection. A broad response may reduce visible pressure faster while creating a larger failure later. Could it overload another unit, weaken another workflow, create unclear responsibility, or continue longer than intended? Could the emergency department number improve while hospital-wide reliability gets worse? Those are not reasons to avoid action. They are reasons to control it. Tactical resolution is not waiting. The problem has already crossed the line where identify and postpone would fit. Boarding is actively affecting emergency access. It is not strategic evasion. The organization is already inside the problem. It is not automatically critical intervention either. A controlled containment path still exists. That distinction is decision quality. Leaders often believe action becomes stronger as it becomes broader, louder, or more aggressive. That is wrong. A narrow action aimed at the actual interference may be stronger because it protects the rest of the system. The point is not to do less. The point is to apply the necessary action with enough discipline that the response does not become the next problem. This is where tactical resolution connects to the wider direct action system. CSA improves the read before the stabilizing action is selected. Renee separates visible emergency department pressure from the hospital-wide blockage, physical space from usable capacity, and expected movement from completed movement, and Deepen identifies the correct problem navigation strategy. Pro checks what the temporary action could damage. TMC protects direction, ownership, communication, and follow-through. Who owns the next movement? Who owns cleanup? When does the temporary control return for review? ALC captures what repeated, what failed, and what created additional burden. So the next surge begins with a cleaner read. That connection matters, but the point is still tactical resolution. The wider system supports the read, the risk check, the ownership, and the learning. It does not replace the need to stabilize the active interference in front of the leader. Now bring this into your environment. You may lead an emergency department, inpatient unit, nursing operations, bed management, transport, case management, patient access, or another operation connected to flow. The setting may differ. The pattern will not. An active problem interferes with the objective. The full correction is unavailable. The team must keep operating. Someone proposes a temporary move. The first visible pressure improves. Then the burden appears somewhere else. Where's that happening in your operation? What temporary action is being treated as free when it transfers workload? What information are you calling reliable before it is confirmed? Do not build a 20-question checklist. Start with 4. What is the exact interference? What is the narrowest action that could reduce it? What could that action damage somewhere else? When will you check whether it worked? Those questions do not solve the full capacity problem. They improve recognition before urgency turns a temporary response into a second failure. Here's the field-level takeaway. Do not judge the stabilization only by what moved. Judge it by whether the objective became more protected. Judge it by whether the receiving path held. Judge it by whether the temporary burden remained visible. Judge it by whether ownership stayed attached to the work. Judge it by whether the hospital knows when to reassess. Emergency department boarding is not controlled because the emergency department number went down. Hospital flow is controlled when the movement is real, the receiving path is ready, the work is owned, the limits are understood, and the temporary action does not quietly break another part of the system. The emergency department may be where boarding becomes visible. The hospital is where the interference has to be stabilized. The leader cannot create permanent capacity during one morning. The leader cannot correct every structural driver during one shift. The leader can still prevent uncontrolled movement from spreading the failure. That is the discipline tactical resolution provides. Act because the problem cannot wait. Keep the action narrow because the wider system still matters. Understand what the temporary move could damage. Keep ownership attached to the work. Reassess before the workaround becomes normal. And do not clear the emergency department by breaking the rest of the hospital. Restore enough controlled movement to protect emergency access. Then return to the deeper work, the boarding condition exposed. When you are ready to go deeper with this tool, go to www.direct-action-system.io/course-directory. Open the course directory, find the course tied to tactical resolution and the Deepen module, and start there. That is where the deeper application belongs. Thanks for listening to the briefing.